Nero, the afterlife of an emperor. Murder planned and death implemented. This is an account of how Nero was driven from power, and how people who resembled the image of Nero reappeared several times to threaten Rome long after his apparent death. In AD 65, a group of plotters agreed that the emperor would have to be murdered, and it would have to be done in public, in full view of the people, enacted before adoring crowds. Tacitus reports. Nero would go to the entertainments at the circus racetrack. Here access to him was easier, since he was fully engrossed in the spectacle. Details of the plot were arranged. Eternius was a man of strong nerve, who had a huge frame. He was to throw himself at the emperor's feet, earnestly appealing for funds to repay his financial debts. He would launch himself at Nero, hurling him to the ground and holding him down. When the emperor was prostrate and powerless, the tribunes and centurions, and all the others who had sufficient daring, were to rush upon him and commit the murder. Scavinius claimed the first strike. He carried a dagger, a sacrificial weapon, as though it were dedicated to doing some noble deed. Scavinius had taken this dagger from the Temple of Safety, or according to another account, from the Temple of Fortune in the town of Ferentum. Tacitus, The Annals, Book 15, Passage 53. But why take such a risk, and butcher the emperor in full view of the Roman people? The deed could have been conducted in secret. One of the main participants in the plot, the man most likely to be acclaimed the next emperor, was named Gaius Calpurnius Piso. Tacitus confirms that Nero often entered Piso's villa, unguarded and without the cumbersome grandeur of his rank. Perhaps killing Nero in this place was viewed as unsanctified, or perhaps the plotters distrusted the resolve of their fellow conspirators. Or maybe they understood, only too well, that in order to convince the people that Nero was dead, the emperor had to die in public, to fully destroy his image and legacy. By chance, the plot was discovered, its details were betrayed, and the conspirators were rounded up and eliminated. Nero lived. For now. My name is Dr. Raoul McLaughlin. The question is, how did Nero die? And who were the Nero impersonators who came afterwards? The Emperor Nero had come to power in AD 54. He had received the supreme office aged 17 and ruled as emperor for just 14 years. During his reign, he was accused of many offences against the imperial household and provoked the animosity of the ruling senatorial elite. When a series of military uprisings in the provinces caused dissension in Rome, Nero fled to the villa of his freedman, Phaon, and there he committed suicide. Nero's death occurred in June of AD 68. The ancient sources provide details, but there were few witnesses to the actual events, and false reports soon circulated. This encouraged a belief that the emperor had somehow survived and escaped to the east. It was said that one day he would return to regain his imperial birthright, restore the Judeo-Claudian dynasty, and increase the glory of imperial Rome once more. How did the Senate report the death of Nero, and why did people refute the account? The previous emperors Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius had all died in old age. The notorious Emperor Caligula was the exception, and he was brutally murdered in the centre of Rome. By contrast, the death of Nero was said to have occurred in private, far away from immediate public view and reaction. In the capital, the emperor's authority was backed by a force of over 5,000 soldiers known as the Praetorian Guard. In addition to this, the emperor maintained a loyal bodyguard of over 500 Germanic warriors recruited from allied tribes on the northern frontiers. The Germani, corporis custodes, had no formal connections to the Roman elite and were expected to be personally loyal to the imperial household. In AD 41, when senators and members of the Praetorian Guard had been involved in the public assassination of the Emperor Caligula. These Germanic troops hunted for his killers. They searched in nearby thoroughfares, in private residences, and in public venues, determined to carry out a final service for their commandant. So why didn't the Germanic custodes appear in the ancient narratives concerning the death of Nero? The answer lies with the military revolts that ended the reign of Nero. Insurrections began in Gallia Lugdunensis, a territory extending from central to western Gaul. This province was under the command of a governor named Gaius Julius Vindex, a Roman citizen of Gallic descent. Vindex emphasized his Gallic ancestry, and to gain popularity in the province, made appeals based on his native heritage. It could therefore be that imperial advisers counseled the emperor that he should not appear in the presence of northern barbarians at this time of conflict. The Germanic Guard may have been quietly stood down, leaving Nero entirely dependent on his Praetorian Guard. Nero was in Naples when he received news that legions in Gaul were in revolt. According to Suetonius, the emperor did not act on the news for a full 8 days. He ignored urgent messages from the Senate, failed to appoint commanders for the conflict, and did not summon assistance from the legionary armies that remained loyal. According to Suetonius, when Nero did return to Rome, he refused to address the Senate or call any public assemblies. Instead, the emperor summoned several leading statesmen to the palace and consulted them in private. Over the following days, Nero continued to appear at popular engagements and crowded entertainment venues. At these public events, he maintained the appearance of normality and ridiculed the challenge posed by his opponents. This performance continued even after news arrived that the legion in Spain had joined the revolt and proclaimed their commander Sevius Galba as emperor. Galba was from a distinguished noble family who could legitimately claim the supreme office of state. He therefore represented a serious threat to Nero's authority. In Rome, there was increasing evidence that public sentiment was becoming hostile to Nero. Statues were vandalized or daubed with political slogans and graffiti. Some of these alluded to Nero's success in artistic competitions and promised him that a real contest was coming. Sacks were tied to his statues, suggesting the possible manner of his execution. At nightfall, dissenters could be heard yelling insults in the street and chanting slogans. If challenged, they used the pretense that they were calling to or coercing their wayward slaves. When the emperor was at a banquet, news arrived that more northern armies had joined the revolt in support of Galba. Nero suffered an outburst of anger. He overturned his table, smashing his favourite drinking vessels. Then he retreated from public view. There was little to suggest what the emperor might be thinking or feeling. There is scant evidence as to what Nero was planning to keep his position, or even preserve his own life. It should be noted that the eastern legions were still loyal, and a significant army had already been concentrated in the Near East to suppress a Jewish rebellion in Judea. According to Suetonius, the emperor decided to flee from Rome, accompanied by his Praetorian Guard. If Nero could get to Egypt, he could establish Alexandria as his new imperial capital. From this strategic centre, he could control the essential grain supply to Rome and might starve the city into submission. He could deploy the eastern legions to defeat his enemies, retake Italy, and become emperor again. Nero went to the Praetorian barracks, near the Servilian Gardens. Once there, he found his orders for immediate assistance simply ignored. Suetonius reports, "First he sent his most trustworthy freedmen to the docks at Ostia to get a fleet ready. Then he tried to induce the tribunes and centurions of the guard to accompany him in his escape. Some gave evasive answers, and some openly refused. One of them even cried out, 'Is it so dreadful a thing to die?'" Suetonius, Life of Nero. This refusal was the beginning of mass dissension. Without the Praetorians, The emperor had no coercive means to enforce obedience in Rome. Suetonius lists the options available to Nero, including surrendering himself to Galba. He might hope for leniency, due to his popularity among the masses. He could also use his heritage as a direct descendant of the first Emperor Augustus. Nero also considered escape to the Parthian Empire, the powerful eastern rival of Rome that ruled ancient Persia. A third option was to appeal directly to the Roman populace. Widespread public sentiment might guarantee his survival. He might even be appointed to a lower political position in the state. This seemed feasible, since the Julio-Claudian dynasty was still held in great renown. But there was no precedent for an emperor abdicating or being dismissed from office. Suetonius describes how Nero considered this last option. He planned to wear the colours of public mourning and address the people directly from the speaker's platform. Suetonius reports, Nero turned over various plans in his mind. Should he go as a supplicant to the Parthians, or Galba, or appear to the people on the rostra? He would dress in black and beg as pathetically as he could for pardon for his past offences. And if he could not soften their hearts, he would entreat them to at least allow him the prefecture of Egypt. After Nero's death, a speech composed for this purpose was found in his writing desk. But it is thought that he did not dare to carry out this plan for fear of being torn to pieces before he could even reach the Forum. Suetonius, Life of Nero. As night fell, unable to enact a coherent plan of action, the despondent emperor returned to the imperial palace. He hoped that the following morning might provide better clarity or present a new opportunity. However, when he woke in the night, he discovered that he was alone. His personal guard were gone. They had abandoned their position. Suetonius writes, He woke about midnight and found that the guard of soldiers had left him. He sprang from his bed and sent for all his friends. No reply came back from anyone. With a few followers, he himself went to their rooms. He found that all their doors were closed and no one replied to him. So he returned to his own bedchamber. There he discovered that his personal attendants had also fled, taking everything of value with them, including the bed sheets and a box of poison. At once he summoned the gladiator, Spicallus, and anyone else who might be adept at killing. He thought by this means he might find death. But when no one appeared, he cried out, So then, I have neither a friend nor a foe? Suetonius, Life of Nero. Aware that he was now powerless and vulnerable within the palace, Nero decided to flee. But his features were too well known through statues and public appearances. Suetonius reports, Nero sought a secluded place, a place where he could hide and collect his thoughts. His freedman, Phaon, offered his villa in the suburbs between the Via Nomentana and the Via Solaria, near the 4th milestone. So Nero left the palace as he was, barefoot and in his tunic. He put on a faded cloak, covered his head, and held a cloth hand towel over his face. Then he mounted a horse, taking with him only 4 attendants. Suetonius, Life of Nero. Incognito and unnoticed, the small group passed by the garrison station of the Praetorian Guard. It was said that Nero could hear shouts of soldiers predicting his destruction and the success of Galba in the coming conflict. But Nero and his small party were not the only travellers on the road leaving Rome that night. The fleeing figures soon attracted attention. Suetonius reports dramatic incidents demonstrating the confusion and urgency of their escape. He writes, Nero heard one of the passers-by say, These men are going after Nero. Another stopped the travellers to ask, "Is there anything new in the city about Nero?" Then, at a place where a corpse had been thrown out into the road, Nero's horse took fright at the smell. Suddenly his face was revealed. A retired soldier of the Praetorian Guard recognized him and immediately saluted. Suetonius, Life of Nero. It was still dark when the party reached the outskirts of the villa. According to Suetonius, they turned their horses loose, and fearing informants, they approached via a rear path that led through bushes, brambles, and reeds to the back wall of the estate. Phaon urged the emperor to conceal himself in a pit where some sand had been dug out, but Nero refused and waited for his companions to break through the wall and force a secret entrance into an outbuilding. Even at this stage, Nero could not be certain what political opposition he was facing in Rome. Everything changed near daybreak when a courier reached the villa with a letter addressed to Phaon. The letter announced that in his absence the Senate had pronounced Nero a public enemy and sought to punish him in the ancient fashion. As a dishonoured magistrate, he would be stripped, fastened by the neck to a wooden prong, paraded through the streets, and then publicly beaten to death with rods. His mutilated body could be symbolically cast off the Tarpeian rock, or dumped in the sewage-laden Tiber as though it were an animal carcass. A later writer, known as John of Antioch, provides details. He writes, "The Roman Senate declared him an enemy, and decreed that he should pay the penalty imposed on those who had committed high crimes while in office. It is prescribed that the culprit shall be led to the prison naked, with a forked stick fastened about his neck. Then, after his body has been soundly flogged, he shall be hurled down a rock face." John of Antioch. Informers possibly revealed the presence of the fugitive emperor on the estate, or maybe parties of soldiers were even now instructed to search the homes of his closest advisers. Then, when Nero heard the galloping approach and cries of horsemen, he knew what was coming. He unsheathed the dagger he had kept in his possession, and aided by his private secretary, he slit his own throat. A single centurion rushed into the room and held a cloak to the wound to try to stem the flow of blood. Suetonius writes, "He was almost dead when a centurion rushed in, and pretending that he had come to aid him, placed a cloak to the wound. Nero merely gasped, 'Too late,' and 'This is loyalty.' With these final words he died. His eyes were so set and staring from their sockets that all who saw him shuddered with horror." Suetonius, Life of Nero. The heads of condemned or defeated political enemies were often publicly displayed, but Nero was spared this humiliation. Perhaps this was due to the respect many held for the Julio-Claudian name, or the sanctified office of emperor. Perhaps the Senate feared that the trophy head might encourage public sympathy for the deceased ruler. Or maybe supporters of Galba considered it a dangerous precedent to display the remains of ousted emperors. A freedman of Galba arranged that the emperor's body should not be mutilated. Instead, Nero was given a relatively inexpensive funeral service. He was laid out in white robes embroidered with gold thread, and cremated. The ashes were not placed in the imperial mausoleum with those of Augustus and the other Julio-Claudian emperors. Instead, they were deposited in the family tomb of the Domitii, on the summit of the Pincian Hill. This was the ancestral resting place of his father's lineage. According to Suetonius, many ordinary people were exuberant at the death of Nero. In the streets of Rome, they wore symbolic liberty caps to signal their freedom from an oppressive slave master. A later writer named Zonaras describes the public mood and suggests that close political associates of the former emperor were also murdered, Zonarius reports. The people in Rome went wild with delight and filled the city with garlands. Some even wore liberty caps, signifying that they had now become free. And the Senate voted to Galba all the honours and entitlements belonging to the emperorship. The populace jeered at Nero, and killed and dragged away the bodies of many of those people who had been made powerful through his influence. Zonarus. Statues of the deposed emperor were torn down, defaced or demolished. These images were probably subject to symbolic abuse that replicated the punishments prescribed to the condemned emperor. John of Antioch explains. They decorated the city with garlands and torches, and the people offered prayers and held celebrations of genuine thanksgiving. They killed those who had been powerful under the tyrant, and they pulled down his images and statues as if they were abusing the despot himself. John of Antioch. These revellers were prominent in the city in the aftermath of Nero's death, but some of the population had a lingering sentiment for Nero and maybe regretted his demise. Suetonius confirms. Such was the public rejoicing that the people put on liberty caps and ran about all over the city. Yet there were some who for a long time decorated his tomb with spring and summer flowers. They placed images of Nero on the rostra, dressed in the fringed toga, and displayed his edicts as if he were still alive and would shortly return and deal destruction to his enemies. Suetonius, Life of Nero. Nero had died, aged just 30, the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. This ruling family had brought a century of unprecedented stability, security, and prosperity to the Roman Empire. As Suetonius suggests, many Romans simply refused to accept the version of events propagated by the Senate and the new Emperor Galba. There had been no public execution. They had seen no body. What if the emperor still lived? What if he had escaped to the east after all, and was somewhere else, gathering his armies and planning his return to Rome? The following lectures will examine the legacy of the last Julio-Claudian emperor and the enigma of the Nero impersonators. Thank you for your attention.